This lecture, entitled The Columbian Exchange, Disease and Population, is the second part of the unit Disease, Contagion, and Public Health. It asks the question, why do we live where we live? The theme and title of this lecture are taken from an influential book by Alfred Crosby entitled The Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492. Crosby's book examines the far-reaching effects on both Europe and the Americas of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the new continent in 1492. The reading for the Columbian Exchange is a later article by Crosby called Ecological Imperialism, the Overseas Migration of Western Europeans as a Biological Phenomenon. So in this lecture we'll focus on the migration of human beings and diseases. In the next lecture we'll look at food and plants. We'll also read John Richard's Chapter 9, Columbian Exchange, the West Indies. Read it all, but for this lecture we'll look especially at the section on population and disease. What is the global impact of the Columbian Exchange in terms of population or the effects on human beings? The effects of the Columbian Exchange are still felt today. Patterns of world migration from the Old World to the New began immediately and then picked up pace within decades of the discovery of the Americas. There's an important point here, and I will come back to this at the end when we look at the transatlantic slave trade. But for the first 3 centuries, blacks or Africans outnumbered white Europeans in migration to the Americas. That's something that's easily forgotten in today's society. There's a second question looming here. The Americas were already full of people. Probably somewhere between 43 and 65 million people lived in the Americas. So why did Europeans think that African slaves were required for manual labor? And that answer has to do with pathogens or microorganisms and is the subject of this short lecture, The Columbian Exchange, Disease, and Population. So the first decline in the population of the indigenous peoples of the West Indies probably occurred because of their use as laborers in the gold mines. That's what the Europeans went there for, gold and silver. Their use as agricultural producers, and the idea, that didn't last very long, of sending the captives back to Europe. But if we take, for example, the island of Hispaniola, which is the modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, between 1492 and 1542, in only 50 years or half a century, the indigenous peoples on Hispaniola became virtually extinct. At contact in 1492, and these numbers are wildly estimated. No one really knows. There's no census in this time period. No one really knows how many indigenous peoples there were in the Americas. But from the early estimates, there were, say, maybe 500,000, 500,000, some say 1 million. By the next year, in 1493, a European illness was already present as influenza, and others suggest that a swine flu came with the pigs on board. By 1508, there were only 60,000 indigenous peoples on the island of Hispaniola. By 1510, and here the Spaniards did an actual count because they wanted to count their people, they came up with 33,523, and you can find this in your reading. By 1514, they were down to 26,344. And in 1518 to 19, and this is before any epidemics, about 18,000. By 1542, only 2,000. And today, really, you can only find indigenous peoples as mixed race peoples. If you do sort of a DNA check, they mixed with the Spaniards, they mixed with African slaves. But there's no such thing as a pure Arawak person or Carib. So there's a historical question here that is raised in books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. How were the Europeans able to overpower the indigenous peoples of the Americas on their home territory? Yes, the Europeans had guns and horses and other advantages, but this is a story that begins with pathogens or microorganisms. So let's look at the diseases that went on a trip to the Americas. Smallpox, typhus, typhoid, measles, influenza, chickenpox, whooping cough, malaria, diphtheria, scarlet fever. Later on, we'll throw in the bubonic plague. So what was the transatlantic voyage? This is a map of Columbus's 4 journeys in 1492, 1493, 1498, and 1502. If you look here, Spain has a little bit of an advantage over the rest of Europe in that it kind of sticks out. It's much closer for the transatlantic voyages to the New World and also to Africa. From Cadiz, which is about 150 kilometers south of the city of Seville, you can travel fairly quickly in about 10 days' journey to Madeira and the Canary Islands, stop, replenish supplies, and then carry on, taking about another 40 days to the islands of Martinique or Guadeloupe, and carry on a little bit further to the island of Hispaniola, maybe to Cuba. And you'll notice that it's only on the 3rd voyage, and that's in green, that Columbus actually went to the mainland. He didn't realize until the 3rd voyage that he had actually discovered a huge landmass. How did the diseases go to America? When we read the first-hand accounts, the first documented outbreak of smallpox that we can find in separate accounts occurred on the 10th of January, 1518-19. The friars on the island of Hispaniola reported to Charles V, the Emperor Charles V. He's the Holy Roman Emperor across most of Germany, Austria, Spain, the Netherlands in Europe. It has pleased our Lord to bestow a pestilence of smallpox among the said Indians of Hispaniola, and that it does not cease, and from it have died and continue to die to the present almost 1/3 of the said Indians. There was another outbreak on the mainland among the Aztecs in Mexico, and this is what's illustrated here. There were growing signs of these outbreaks in one place and another, and signs therefore of a growing epidemic. The Spaniard Juan Cortez had actually arrived with about 600 Spaniards and his guns and horses on the coast of Mexico around that time. An epidemic broke out, a sickness of pustules. Large bumps spread on people. Some were entirely covered. The victims, they could no longer walk about, but lay in their dwellings and sleeping places, and when they made a motion, they called out loudly. The pustules that covered people caused great desolation. Very many people died of them, and many just starved to death. Starvation reigned, and no one took care of others any longer. This is a child's hand who has been infected with smallpox. And I just give you that image to make you understand just how horrible it is. So smallpox arrived overland from Panama to Peru, and it also attacked the Inca Empire. So it attacks the Aztecs, it attacks the Incas. And the emperor, who was the 11th Inca emperor, died. And he died within 4 days. And his tiny infant son, his heir, also died. One of the things that happened is that they actually began to transfer the corpse back to the imperial city. So it's another way in which the epidemic spreads. And you have to remember that for these empires, for the Aztecs, for the Incas, there's a complete loss of leadership. They are struck down at the knees. So this same story repeated itself across the Americas. Crops are not tended. There's a loss of leadership. There's malnutrition. There's starvation. The diseases arrived on the Pacific coast, first breaking out alongside the present Canada-US border, here in this blue areas near Fort Langley, and then smallpox traveled north along the coast and south. The diseases also went inland from the Atlantic and the Pacific to the areas roamed by the Sioux in the modern-day states of North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So these drawings on a cotton cloth record major historical events among the Sioux over a period of 1798 to 1902. And some of these are the smallpox epidemics. What were the effects of the disease? Well, among the Aztecs in Mexico, the graphic here gives you a sense of 20 to 25 million in around 1500. Other sources say 16 to 18 million. Again, it's very, very unknown. There's no census. What we do know is that by about 1646, there were only 1.2 million Aztecs. In the Andes, among the Inca, there were maybe 13 to 15 million, and this was reduced to about 1 million by 1650. As mentioned in the reading, Both the Aztec and the Inca civilizations were at least double the size of the populations that Spain and Portugal enjoyed at that time. The Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, only had 6.5 million people. The populations of the Americas do begin to recover, and that's in part due to the continued migration of Africans, Spaniards, and of course the beginning of mixing of races. And by 1800, perhaps as a whole, the Americas had recovered to 18 million. The only disease that Europe received in return was syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that really kind of worsens over years or decades. It's a variation or a mutation of a disease in South America, and this is really still a topic very much under research, especially with the DNA of syphilis victims and the bones of syphilis victims in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Current studies suggest that this was the only disease that came from west to east, and the science of DNA is pointing to what historians have always suspected. Syphilis came back with Columbus sailors to Europe and spread through the prostitutes that the sailors visited in port cities like Naples. It's pretty horrible. It starts out with lesions and eventually attacks the brain and bones, but over decades. You don't die of it within 5 days. If we look at the world population, both free and forced migration, we see waves and waves of Spanish migration in the annual fleets, and that's maybe 800,000 Spaniards in total over the centuries of the Spanish Empire. Add in the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British as mostly free migrants. Some of these migrants would have, of course, been indentured servants or serving soldiers. Either way, the white Europeans were totally outnumbered by the forced migration of Africans. So we're going to look for a moment at a website called slavevoyages.org. We have access to the numbers of slaves put on board of ships by each country engaged in the slave trade. So whether that's Spain sending them to South America, whether that's Portugal sending them to Brazil, whether that's Great Britain, the Netherlands, the Americans when they finally became a nation, France, or even the Danish. Wouldn't expect the Danish to engage in such things. The total number from 1500 to the mid 1800s, the total number of Africans who were placed on slave ships was 12,521,336. So we're going to look at this in a slightly different way. Here we can see in a timeline the number of captives embarked and disembarked per year. So we can see the intensity of the Atlantic slave trade over time. And here I'm just going to scroll across, and you can see the numbers changing in this area, embarked and disembarked. And you can see the numbers changing. I want you to think about the numbers and how they're going to intensify over this time period into the 1600s. And why is there a discrepancy between embarked and disembarked? Well, many died from malnutrition, many died from illnesses on board the slave ships. And here you can see some very, very high numbers into the 1700s. We're looking at almost, for some, 100,000 in 1788. 112,000 in 1790. And this is at this point when you begin to have the abolition movement in Britain and France and the beginnings of the end of the slave trade. Unlike the populations of the Americas, the number of slaves is highly accurate because the slaves were stock, they were inventory, they were branded and sold. Just as merchants kept track of their cargo, where it came from, and where it was sold, so did the slave traders keep track of their human cargo. Sadly, the historical and commercial records of the 10 million Africans who survived the Middle Passage to land in the Americas is well documented. The fraction of today's population that has ancestors who lived in their present country are shown in this graphic. You can also find it in Table 4 provided as a handout. So it's very, very small. The areas that are mostly this kind of fuchsia purpley color are people who are indigenous to their own regions. So places like Asia, people are mostly of Asian descent. The areas where there's change, where there's migration, are the areas of the New World. So the USA and Canada, Brazil, the Caribbean, but also Australia and New Zealand. So 0% of the people who currently live in the Caribbean are of indigenous populations. 3% roughly for the US and Canada, Australia and New Zealand. 94 to 98% of people in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia have ancestors who lived in that country in 1500. So the conclusion is, what is the long-term global impact of the Columbian Exchange in terms of population or human beings?